I want to thank my friend, Mr. Garrett, Speaker, and it is important that we discuss what's been going on in Iran. I recall I was on active duty in the United States Army back when President Carter stood by and basically encouraged the taking out of the Shah of Iran. No prince, according to his own conduct, but he made a statement welcoming the Ayatollah Khomeini back to Iran as what he called him, I believe it was, a man of peace. He could not have been more wrong. There's been less peace because the Ayatollah Khomeini took over a state government, a national government, and a powerful military than any time since World War II. They have been the largest sponsor of state terrorism. They have, we've been told, probably most of the IEDs that have killed and maimed Americans fighting for freedom in the Middle East, especially in Iraq. They have worked to stir up trouble all over the Middle East, North Africa, created massive mayhem, and are looking to do even more. And with the $100 billion or more that President Obama sent to Iran, they've been able to make more IEDs to kill more Americans, create more havoc, and store up more sentiment against the United States since that unconstitutional sending under a treaty that was never ratified was done by the last administration. Some want to blame President Trump for the problems in Iran. That's a bit ridiculous. The problems are the radical Islamist leadership in Iran. In fact, the same people that would like to blame President Trump are some of the same ones that hailed the $100 billion sent under a treaty that was never ratified that would be used to kill innocent people around the world, including Americans. The people of Iran are to be congratulated for saying enough is enough. There's a great article from Commentary Magazine titled "What the Iran Protests Have Already Achieved." Sohrab Amari says more than 1,700 arrests and at least 24 deaths later, the Tehran regime seems to have suppressed Iran's latest mass uprising. Scattered protests and skirmishes continue nationwide, according to the citizen journalists who, braving regime violence, continue to post footage on social media. But for now, the demonstrations don't seem to be growing in numbers or frequency. Yet outside observers tempted to write off the movement should recall that the 1979 Islamic revolution that toppled the Shah began decades earlier. There were lulls through the years which tempted President Carter at one point to describe the Shah's Iran as, quote, an island of stability, unquote, in the Middle East. Whatever the ultimate outcome, however, the protesters have already accomplished a great deal and shattered many myths in the West. Let's review their achievements. First, the Iran protests showed that the people are not rallying to the regime under the press of President Trump's hawkish rhetoric. Far from being, quote, swept up in a wave of nationalist fervor, unquote, as the New York Times' Thomas Erdbrink reported a few weeks before the uprising, Iranians still detest their corrupt, repressive regime. As my colleague, and this is the author, Mr. Amari speaking, as my colleague Noah Rothman has noted on our podcast, Americans have an almost religious conviction that world events revolve around the United States and especially the White House. To be sure, America remains the most important nation on the world stage, yet the average Iranian does not wake up in the morning cursing Donald Trump for trying to undo the nuclear deal. More likely, the Iranian curses the fact that he can't even afford eggs to feed his children. And there are more proximate actors whom he blames for that, namely the mullahs. Second, the uprising revealed once and for all that Iranian President Hassan Rouhani has been no moderate, and that the reformer versus hardliner distinction is meaningless. Ever since he came to power, Rouhani has been the subject of adulation among members of the Western foreign policy establishment. The media attached the moderate and reformer labels to Rouhani on the night of his first election in June 2013 and refused to remove them even as evidence mounted that he was no such thing. There was Rouhani's leading role in the violent repression of the 1999 student uprising, his support for the post-2009 crackdown, his long record of anti-American rhetoric, quote, the beautiful cry of death to America unites our nation, unquote, his decidedly immoderate cabinet, his work overseeing Iran's campaign of assassinations targeting dissidents abroad, and much else of the kind. But now Iranians themselves are plainly telling the West that Rouhani is no moderate. Their slogans, quote, not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life only for Iran, unquote, and, quote, let Syria be, do something for me, unquote, are a reminder that Tehran has continued to underwrite terror and bloodshed across the Middle East during the 4+ years of Rouhani's presidency. The people have also been chanting, quote, reformist, hardliners, and the whole game is over, unquote. Let's hope the same realization soon dawns in Washington and Brussels. Third, the protesters put the lie to the Obama administration's claims about the 2015 nuclear deal. Remember when senior Obama officials reassured Americans that Iran would use the sanctions relief under Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action to improve the lots of its people. Here's how Obama Treasury Secretary Jack Lew put it in April 2015 address. Quote, many Americans and many of our closest allies are understandably concerned that Iran will use the money it receives as a result of sanctions relief to fund terrorism and support destabilizing proxies throughout the Middle East. We share their concerns, and we're committed to maintaining sanctions that address these activities. Even after Iran takes the steps required to get relief from nuclear sanctions. But it's important to note that the connection between nuclear sanctions relief and Iran's other malign activities is complicated. And most of the money Iran receives from sanctions relief will not be used to support those activities. I would interject here, he had absolutely 100% no basis for making such ridiculous statements. 2 months later, Colin Kahl, a national security advisor to then Vice President Joe Biden, told the Truman Center, quote, it is our assessment that the Iranians are not going to spend the vast majority of the money on guns. Most of it will go to butter, unquote. I'd insert here, he had no basis whatsoever for making such statements. Article says millions of jobless and impoverished Iranians now beg to differ. Turns out the regime was happy to spend the JCPOA, the Iran treaty that was never ratified, spend those funds on Hezbollah, Hamas, the Yemeni Houthis, and other nasties, even if it meant that Iranians would go hungry. And those hungry people aren't mistaken about the roots of their hunger. Iran remains the world's top state sponsor of terror, Deal opponents warned of this, only to be brushed aside by Obama and his media allies. The Trump administration now has an opportunity to correct course by walking away from Obama's bad deal. The American people are under no obligation to finance Iran's terrorist statecraft. The mullahs would have no one to blame but themselves. The Iranian people, defeated but unbowed, are sure to have another day. So, Mr. Speaker, let me just add here, God bless President Donald J. Trump for recognizing the Iranian treaty for the horrible deal it was and is to peace in our time. He paid for war, he paid for terrorism, and it's time to stop it. I yield back to my friend, Mr. Garrett.